Who built and lived at 10236 Charing Cross Road before it was the infamous Playboy Mansion? Did Mrs. Letts actually die there? And was the estate, once known as Statham House, home to a Rembrandt painting? Let's find out on Historical Tea. By 1900, there were 100,000 residents in the Los Angeles basin. There were active ports, railways, farms, shops, banks, and factories. People were moving into the city at a high rate, and one of those people was Arthur Letts, an Englishman. Without him, the mansion would have never existed. He arrived in Los Angeles in 1896. That same year, he opened the Broadway, a department store which, along with some other business ventures, made him extremely wealthy. He built a sprawling estate named Holmby House. Seen here, the Tudor-style home was a gardener's paradise, and he was an active gardener with hothouses of his own. We can see he and his family living there in the estate in this 1910 census, along with servants and a chauffeur. In 1919, he bought 400 acres in western Los Angeles. He planned to develop them into neighborhoods, which he named Westwood and Holmby Hills. But things didn't go as planned for Arthur Sr. He filed for divorce from his wife Florence in 1923. In this The Record news bit from May 1st, 1923, we see that he's filed suit. Arthur Letts Sr. has filed a suit for divorce against his wife Florence M. Letts in Superior Court on the ground of desertion. The complaint states that they were married in Toronto, Canada, and that the desertion took place about April of last year, so 1922, about a year before this article. And it also shows that a property settlement agreement has been arranged. Mrs. Letts has lived in San Francisco for the last year or more, but Letts continues to occupy the family home at Hollywood. Just a week later, Arthur Letts Sr.'s death is reported in the newspapers. Arthur Letts is pneumonia victim. Los Angeles, May 18th, 1923. Arthur Letts, millionaire, owner of the Broadway department store, one of the foremost department stores in the West, died at his home near Hollywood early this morning. Side note, this is Holmby House, not the mansion. He dies before the mansion's built. Mr. Letts' death was due to pneumonia brought on by a nervous breakdown. He was 61 years old. His wife, from whom he was separated, is living in San Francisco. After his death, Arthur Letts Sr. left his business to his son and his estate to his son and two daughters. Arthur Jr. was born in 1891 in Seattle and married his first wife, Bessie, in 1914. Here is a 1922 passport application for both Arthur Jr. and his wife, Bessie. We can also see Arthur Sr. signing as a witness, essentially saying these people are who they say they are. The couple, who had been married about 12 years at this point, did not have children of their own, but 1926 proved to be a busy year. In July of that year, they adopted twins who they named David and Diane. So the Bentley and Shannon twins were not the first sets to live in the mansion. And in August, it's reported that the Letts family has broken ground on the future Playboy Mansion. We see an architect's rendering here in the Los Angeles Sunday Times from August 29th, 1926. The mansion was designed by architect Arthur Kelly, who also designed the home where Dax Shepard and Kristen Bell live. We can see a photograph of the progress on the home. This was taken in February 1927. It appeared in the Los Angeles Times. It says, "Construction progress on Arthur Letts Jr. dwelling, now rising in Holmby Hills. rapid progress is being made on construction of the new Arthur Letts Jr. mansion in Holmby Hills, which when completed will be one of the finest residences in Southern California. It is to be of the rambling English type. The work of landscaping the grounds is now underway, rare plants and trees for the estate being furnished by the famous Letts hothouses in Hollywood. This home is one of the many fine dwellings being built in Holmby Hills, which is being developed by the Jans Investment Company. It should be noted that Jans is the Jans brothers, from my understanding, is who Arthur Letts Sr. had ended up selling those 400 acres to, but it also happened to be his daughter's husband, so it's all in the family here. In the 1930 census, which is taken in April every decade, we see Arthur and Bessie are living in the mansion with their 6-year-old twins, but not for much longer. By February 1931, after 15 years of marriage, they are divorced from each other, and both are remarried. This society paper reported that many smart postnuptial affairs are being arranged in honor of Mr. and Mrs. Francis Hahn, whose wedding was an event of a fortnight ago. Mrs. Hahn, it will be recalled, was formerly Mrs. Bessie Baker Letts. Mr. and Mrs. Hahn are now on their honeymoon, but expect to return to Los Angeles in about 10 days. They will make their home in Beverly Hills. We see here in the 1940 census, Bessie is still living along with her husband, Francis. They live in Beverly Hills. The twins live with them. This image shows the proximity of Bessie's home from the mansion. So if there was a Mrs. Letts who died at the mansion, it wasn't Bessie, but there are still 2 more Mrs. Lettses in the future. Meanwhile, Arthur married Mrs. Bard Van Cott, a New York society matron. This marriage was short-lived, but Bard wasn't. She died at 90 years old, so this is not the Mrs. Letts who died in the mansion, but we still have one more. So, apparently, Arthur Jr. divorced Bard to marry Mrs. Margot C. von Blarcom. Letts to wed sportsman who divorced wife to marry beauty. I believe he's identified as a sportsman here because in researching, I came across dozens of articles where he was participating in golf tournaments. Arthur Letts Jr., millionaire sportsman who recently secured a Reno divorce from Mrs. Bard H. Letts, has filed notice of intention to wed Mrs. Margot C. von Blarcom, Viennese beauty. It was revealed today. Details of a cross-country airplane flight made by Letts to propose to Mrs. Van Blarcom before she boarded a ship for Europe were also revealed. Letts said, "I apparently made a good sales talk and she said yes." The wedding will be performed in the near future at the home of Letts' sister, Mrs. Gladys Letts Jans, in Holmby Hills. The pair, the Viennese beauty and the millionaire sportsman, stayed married until his death in July of 1959. After Arthur Jr.'s death, there were lawsuits filed against the estate by the widow Letts and David and Diane, Arthur Jr.'s adopted children. Remember those twins with Bessie from 1926? Well, they received nothing from his estate upon his death, and they sued. The will stated that the twins had been sufficiently taken care of during Arthur Jr.'s lifetime, and the judge agreed. The case was thrown out. Widow Margot Letts was left with $2,000 per month and the right to live in the house, this is the future Playboy Mansion, for the rest of her life, after which the estate would go to Claremont College. However, the money was not efficient enough to support her and I believe the mansion upkeep, so she sued for and was granted $4,000 a month. Soon after, Mrs. Letts, the widow, moved, and I don't know why, but my assumption is she chose not to stay in the house because of its expensive upkeep, even with winning the case and receiving $4,000 a month. It probably wasn't sufficient. She bought a smaller home at 200 Loring Avenue, still in Holmby Hills. So this Mrs. Letts didn't die at the mansion either. That means none of Arthur Jr.'s, Mrs. Letts's, died at the mansion. So for good measure, I wanted to look into the death of the older Mrs. Letts. So Arthur Jr.'s mother, Arthur Sr.'s wife. Although she or her husband never lived at the mansion, I wanted to cover all my bases just to make sure Mrs. Letts hadn't died there. And in researching, I found that Mrs. Letts Sr. lived her best life post her husband's death in September 1923. She denied marriage to a Mr. Culver Sherrill, a false report which had been made from Paris where she is traveling. This is from The Record, Tuesday, September 18th, 1923, out of Los Angeles. Mrs. Letts denies marriage report. Mrs. Florence Letts, widow of the late Arthur Letts, returned to Los Angeles Monday after a trip abroad and immediately issued a denial of the report that she had been married in Paris to Culver Sherrill of Santa Barbara. I never was so surprised in my life as when this article was called to my attention upon my reaching home, she said. There is absolutely no foundation for such a story, and I can't imagine where it originated. I went to Europe after my husband's death merely to get away from the old surroundings for a time and because I needed a rest. I spent only a part of the time in Paris, and my itinerary included several European cities. On my way home, I stopped in New York and also visited Toronto to attend a family reunion. And that's all there is to be said. By December of that year, she's married to a Charles Quinn. They live in San Francisco for a while, and then in 1936 build the famous Owlwood Estate, where Sonny and Cher later lived. Architectural Digest did a video on it, which I will link to, and the estate just recently sold in 2021 for nearly $100 million. I think what happened is Arthur Letts Sr.'s illness was conflated with Arthur Letts Jr.'s string of marriages, and that is how the Mrs. Letts dying in the Playboy Mansion legend came about. Fear not, mansion haunting purists. Mrs. Letts may not have died there, but she could still be haunting the mansion, and I'm sure there are many other mansion ghosts haunting the halls as well. So, let's go back to 1960 after Arthur Jr.'s death. By 1961, the estate is sold to Louis D. Statham, an insanely wealthy physicist who made his fortune in airplanes and inventions. He and his wife were civic leaders. She was involved in supporting the opera and the arts. Statham purchased the mansion, the future mansion, from the Letts estate managers in 1961. Presumably, those proceeds went to Claremont College as the judge had upheld the will the year before in the case that was brought by David and Diane Letts, Arthur Jr.'s adopted children. After Statham and his wife purchased the house, they began calling it Statham House. And they traveled extensively around the world to furnish the house with artwork, furnishings, collectibles. And we see Louis Statham here with a Rembrandt painting. I want to break down this Rembrandt painting just a little bit because it has an interesting story. So, as you can see, this is a pretty grainy picture. So I did some sleuthing and I was able to, through the provenance of the painting, figure out what painting it actually is. So paintings that have been authenticated have something called a provenance, which is essentially a history of the ownership of the piece. And I found that Mrs. Louis D. Statham of Los Angeles, California, owned this painting between 1956 and 1994. She actually died before that, but their estate still had the painting until that time. But what's interesting is that at one point it was questioned whether this was actually an authentic Rembrandt. It was doubted to be in 1933. It was believed that perhaps Jan Levin, someone from the school of Rembrandt, had painted it, and people were reluctant to credit Rembrandt with this painting at that time. When the piece came to auction again in 1995, it was concluded to be, yes, an original Rembrandt, and therefore we can say the Statham House, the future Playboy Mansion, was home to a Rembrandt painting. The Stathams had paid $13,000 in 1956 for this painting. In modern dollars, that's $141,000, or as much as I paid for my house. Mrs. Statham died in 1965 at the UCLA hospital, so not in the mansion. In his widower years, Mr. Statham lived alone with 6 servants and a dog. And starting in the late 60s, he allowed Les Dames, I think it's Lesdames, so it's probably Les Dames, but I'm going to say Les Dames because I'm a true American, a social hostess group to operate out of the mansion. This was not a charitable organization per se, despite being labeled in one article as a nonprofit. As far as I can tell, they were an organization of hospitality. So rich women, really, really, really rich women, entertaining other rich people, dignitaries, etc. And they used Statham House as an event venue, but they also had an office that they operated out of the property. Here we can see Mrs. Clark Gable. Yes, Mrs. Clark Gable and Mrs. Roy Disney. I believe this is the Mrs. Roy Disney Jr. standing on the mansion stairs in an article titled "Party Givers of the Poshest Persuasion." As far as I can tell, they weren't necessarily raising money for anything. At least it wasn't being reported on. What was being reported on was that it was kind of a secret society, or there was a lot of secrecy surrounding it, and there was a limited number of members. It was limited to 56. They only had one meeting a year. So I might dig into this organization in another video. Let me know in the comments if you'd like to hear more about Les Dames. In June of 68, Statham remarried, and by 1970, he was looking for a buyer for the Statham House. Well, he built a new home in the shadow of the Sierra Nevadas, where he retired with his new wife and became a chess master, and in fact is extremely famous in the chess world. By 1971, the deal was done. This is a report after the sale of Statham House, soon to be renamed. Can you guess what? Out in Holmby Hills, there's a change of pace for the stately Statham House. Or is there? Originally the home of the late Arthur Letts Jr., son of the founder of the Broadway department stores, and more recently owned by the Louis Stathams, who allowed Les Day Champagnes to use the beautiful Tudor mansion as a place to entertain visiting foreign and American VIPs. It now has a new owner. You'll never guess, it's none other than Hugh Hefner of Playboy fame. Willard J. Lewis says the sale is confirmed. Who knows, perhaps HH will want Les Dames to continue their international activities there. Remember their annual 12th night party? Well, that's only a small part of their work, which includes the visiting VIP's hospitality, their efforts in behalf of hospitalized servicemen, and their work with international students. They recruit host families. It will be interesting to see what happens. I am certain Les Dames wasn't having that. Playboy Enterprises and Hugh Hefner hosted 2 housewarming parties after purchasing the estate. One was less formal, in the spring, right after the purchase, and one was in the fall. Here, I'm going to read from Margot's column about the event, the less formal event. Margot Howard is the only child of Eppie Lederer. Quote, I'm quoting from AnnLanders.com here. Lederer is better known as an advice columnist, Ann Landers, who provided guidance in her syndicated column for 47 years until her death in 2002. So her daughter, Margot, was invited to the less formal housewarming party at the mansion. This is her report on Monday, May 17th, 1971. I found this in the Oakland Tribune. Hef's housewarming was heartwarming. We interrupt this recession to bring you a bulletin. Someone still has money. Hugh Hefner bought another house. What is referred to as Playboy Mansion West cost $1.5 million. Such a patriotic gesture in this time of gasping economy. The same wonderful man who gave us the stapled navel has now proved himself a true friend of the GNP. I am diverting here, but I had to Google stapled navel. Apparently, it's a pierced belly button. All right, back to the article. Sentimental soul that he is, Hefner decided to throw a housewarming party. The invitation to 500 folks asked them to come help a new neighbor celebrate his new digs. I, who live a mere 1,800 miles away, figured if Hefner thought of me as a neighbor, the least I could do was attend. So I did. It was your regular housewarming. Guests were met at the entrance by 2 private security guards, a girl with a list, and a cop with a walkie-talkie. Once inside, there was sort of a receiving hairline. Nothing formal, mind you, just a bunch of girls welcoming guests and explaining that they were bunnies, ex-bunnies, playmates, and future playmates. Many of the female guests looked as though they had been selected from a nymphette catalog. Lovely young things, in and out of fringe, hot pants, and bathing suit-like affairs that had been crocheted on large needles. Movie stars were not exactly underfoot, but Ryan O'Neal and John Voight were there. Also, Wilt Chamberlain and a gay Buddhist weirdo. Interesting. All right, continuing on. Plus, a lot of neighbors connected with the various Playboy operations. Employees, I think, is what you'd call them. I thought it was very sweet when a ravishing girl told me she'd been invited to the housewarming while at the candy store. But I learned that the candy store is capital the candy store. It's a discotheque, and the groovy-looking lady did something or other there that didn't require a lot of clothing, which is interesting because those who follow Playboy culture know that it was taboo to be a dancer in the Playboy culture. So I thought that was interesting. While the guests were taxing their livers with 20-year-old scotch, there were tours for the neighbors. The most enthusiastic tour guide was Hefner's young friend, Barbie Benton. Her nickname is Barbie Doll, but the tours established her more as Chatty Cathy. Oh, Margot, the shade. The shade. Okay. Well, anyway, Hef's housewarming was heartwarming. Everybody came away feeling that one of their neighbors really understood about style. All the neighbors were admiring the greenhouse with its 3 temperatures, local, tropical, and rare, and the game room, really a separate building about the size of a 6-room apartment in a modern high-rise. Hef has certainly put his money where his mouth is, and also his nose, eyes, elbows, hands, and knees. I feel like she wanted to add another body part there, too. Despite some shade, Margot's report was generally good. The second formal housewarming was held in November of 1971 as an ACLU benefit, which raised $100,000. I wonder if any of the Les Dames were there. From this time on, the former Let's Statham property became synonymous with the Playboy brand. And the rest is history. Thanks for diving in deep with me. Let me know in the comments if there are any other historical or genealogical deep dives you'd like to take. Signing off for now, that's the Historical Tea.